Hello, my book is called The New Wild, Why Invasive Species Will Be Nature's Salvation. Salvation, you ask? Invasive species? Surely not. It asks a slightly odd question. Can nature be too wild, too feral? That's what I'm going to address. But here is what we're told. Alien species, foreign species, invader species are taking over nature, the world. American crayfish are cruising Europe's rivers. Japanese knotweed is strangling English gardens. This is Swansea in South Wales. Cane toads are poisoning Australian reptiles and much else. European rats and cats are eating the bird life of remote islands. It's scary stuff. Some of the horror stories are true, it has to be said. Australia and New Zealand suffered earlier than most from these invasions, often from deliberate introductions. Well, we don't do that much anymore, but our modern world of globalized trade is giving alien species more and more chances to travel incognito around the planet, set up home in foreign lands, hitchhiking in our hand luggage, hiding in cargo holds, or being discharged from ships' ballast tanks. There are plenty of ways of getting around. Conservationists believe that these feral adventurers are a cancer on native ecosystems and they have to be stopped at all costs. So we see signs like this. American rivergoers are on permanent alert for zebra mussels. Australian highway patrols check under cars for stowaway South American cane toads. New Zealand environmentalists go on bloodthirsty hunts for giant possums in the undergrowth, and so on. Now, as an environment journalist, I have often reported warnings about the havoc that these aliens can cause, but I've sometimes been a bit disturbed by the idea of conservationists going around killing the bits of nature that we don't like. When it comes to it, they don't like things becoming too wild. Strange idea. But now we humans may sometimes have valid reasons for getting rid of troublesome invaders when they bring diseases, say. That's fair enough. I'm not sure our passionate, compassionate conservation extends to microbes. We have a right to do that, I guess, but I wonder, should we be doing this in the name of nature conservation, to protect ecosystems, to protect nature from itself? It feels like a kind of ecological cleansing, a green xenophobia going on. Why do ecologists so often assume that anything bad, anything foreign is bad and disruptive? After all, maybe there is something to be admired in nature's colonists and go-getters. Let's maybe change the language a bit. Are we too hung up on the idea that nature has a proper form based on coevolution, nativism, and ecological stability, or stasis, you might say? That native species are to be desired in an ecosystem. Is that really right? Is there good and bad ecosystems? Are aliens and interlopers shunned or exterminated to protect what is already there? Is there anything intrinsically right about doing that? Are species that have been domesticated or introduced and then gone feral to be despised? Is change in ecosystems to be regarded as somehow intrinsically bad? I think these are the questions which get buried in the assumptions that we make about nativism good, invasive, alien bad. And I cannot accept this nativist view of nature. It seems contrary to the basic spirit and driving force, the wellspring of its resilience, you might say, of evolution itself. Let's draw a parallel. An influx of migrant humans can often be the best way of reviving rundown human neighborhoods. So perhaps migrant species are just what is needed to kickstart the revival of nature in the 21st century. We certainly need a revival, after all. Maybe migrant species are destined to be the vanguard troops for nature's fight back against the damage that humans have done to the planet in the 20th century. Part of the solution, you might argue, rather than part of the problem. If they're such good go-getters, such good colonists, maybe we need them. It's a heretical thought, I agree, but it constantly seems to me that our zeal for ridding the world of alien species makes very little sense. Certainly it sends us in strange directions. Let me start at home in Europe with the story of the ruddy duck. Here it is. It's a native of North America, but was introduced in the 1950s by the British naturalist Sir Peter Scott for his English bird reserve, basically because he liked them. Now, some of them escaped and they began breeding, and some flew south as far as Spain. There they encountered the endangered Spanish white-headed duck, and the local female ducks rather liked these new, bigger American males. They hooked up, produced some hybrid ducks, horror of horrors. Spanish ornithologists certainly were very angry. They'd spent years trying to revive the white-headed duck and to defend its genetic purity. And they demanded a cull of this American ruddy duck right across Europe, and they got their way. A Europe-wide program away. A couple of summers ago, this is a page from a British operation on that. A couple of summers ago, British government-funded marksmen were roaming the British countryside to shoot the last ruddy ducks in Britain. It was costing them by the end £3,000 a bird to kill them. But why? The ruddy ducks did no obvious harm. It's far from clear how many hybrids had been produced at all, anyway. And anyhow, crossbreeding among waterfowl is pretty normal. Genetic purity is a bit of a myth. So if the Spanish senoritas wanted to make out with their American cousins, then I say, why not? Shooting the American birds out of the sky seems a very odd thing for conservationists to be doing, even in the name of genetic purity. And there are other people who think rather similarly. This is from the graffiti artist Banksy. I wonder why we fear these aliens. Is it a nasty dislike of foreigners, as Banksy here suggests? He is incidentally here satirising the British reaction to newly arrived Asian parakeets in London. I like the parakeets, but obviously some people don't. Some people want them to go home. Ecologists deny that they simply hate anything foreign. They say they have more respectable reasons for their actions, their dislike of alien species. Aliens, they say, are intrinsically bad for ecosystems. And the reason they say this goes to the heart of one of the central dogmas of ecology, a worrying dogma, it seems to me. Most ecologists see ideal ecosystems as somehow perfected, unchanging biological machines, if you like, where every native species has evolved to find its unique niche. I simplify a bit, but that's the underlying assumption behind most published research in this area. This was encapsulated by George Perkins Marsh, America's first conservationist. 150 years ago, he wrote that, quote, "Nature left undisturbed so fashions her territory as to give it almost unchanging permanence." If that is true, then outsider species can only bring trouble. They cannot fit in. If ecosystems are perfected, then any change is bad. Any outsider is bad. And ever since Marsh, conservationists have seen their job primarily as defending this perfected nature against outside threats, especially the arrival of alien species. For them, change is bad. But the more we learn, the less it looks as if nature works like that. Nature is never unchanging. It turns out that even without human interference, ecosystems change all the time. American ecologist Daniel Botkin takes the directly opposite view to Marsh. As he says here, wherever we seek to find constancy, we discover change. Nature undisturbed is not constant, but changes at every scale of time and space. This idea of pristine, perfected nature just doesn't work, he says. And this comes from a lifetime of research into specific ecosystems. Species come and go constantly, he says. Change is normal. It is the underpinning of the dynamism of evolution. There is nothing, therefore, intrinsically bad about alien species. Nothing intrinsically bad. They should be judged on their merits. Let's see what they do inside an ecosystem. So what are the merits of aliens? Most ecologists, of course, don't think they have any. In particular, they say that aliens cause mass extinctions among natives, and therefore that they reduce biodiversity. The ecological literature doesn't so much demonstrate this as constantly assume it, to the extent that invader species are often simply not counted when biodiversity is measured. They don't properly belong there, and therefore we will simply ignore them. But a more dispassionate look shows that away from island ecosystems, anyway, which are rather specific and narrow ecosystems with very few species, away from them, there are very few records of actual extinctions as a result of aliens moving in. Usually it's a case of the more species, the merrier. So if we want more biodiversity, maybe more alien species is a good way of getting that, certainly at a local level. So Britain, for instance, has some 2,300 species that are not conventionally regarded as native. Yet none have caused any documented local extinctions. They just add to local biodiversity. In North America, since Europeans arrived, some 4,000 plant species have come too. But what's to fear? A lot of people put up posters like this. They clearly do fear, but why? Those alien arrivals have added a fifth to America's biodiversity. With only a single native extinction that we know of, there may be more, but there clearly isn't a plague of extinctions as a result of the arrival of alien species in North America. I don't deny that there have been extinctions in Australia since Europeans arrived and began transforming local ecosystems, nor indeed in New Zealand. But as Mark Davis of Ecology in the US put it, in Australia, declines in native species typically began decades before the introduction of species later blamed for their extinction. So there's some intellectual laziness going on here, I think, sometimes. Take the arrival of the rabbit, commonly blamed for almost every imaginable ecological crime in Australia. When an English settler named Thomas Austin took 24 European rabbits to his ranch near Geelong in 1859, he wanted nothing more than to feel at home. The shipment also included hares and partridges, blackbirds and thrushes, but the rabbits liked their new home best, and as their numbers grew, Austin invited shooting parties to hunt them. But they outran the guns and escaped, and soon there were millions of them. Famous story, the rabbits were aggressive adventurers, racing north through Queensland by the 1880s, defying bounty hunters and the best efforts of the Intercolonial Rabbit Commission set up to defeat them. They burst through a 2,000-kilometre fence erected to keep them out of Western Australia. They spread a long way, and there's a map showing it. By 1950, there were 500 million of them, and then the government introduced a new alien, a Brazilian disease called myxomatosis, which killed all but a few thousand. Well, it's a dramatic story, and rabbits are widely blamed for turning grasslands across Australia to deserts. But this is all largely scapegoating. The real ecosystem engineering, or damage if you like, had already been done by farmers taking over the grasslands for sheep long before the rabbits arrived and introducing new grasses for them to eat. The colonists built effectively a rabbit paradise. The rabbits couldn't fail, so don't blame the rabbits for their success. They simply occupied the ecological space created for them. But it's far too easy to blame the aliens. That happens a lot. Almost all really successful invasions by alien species happen in ecosystems already severely altered by human activity. So blaming the aliens is blaming the wrong thing if you don't want change. So for take Lake Victoria in East Africa, water hyacinth, which you can see here, spread where waters are polluted with excess nutrients, and that certainly did spread across the lake. A huge, well, you can see, you can't even get boats into the harbour, but the problem is not the water hyacinth, it's the pollution in the lake that allowed them to spread. There was a huge invasion of the Mediterranean by an Indian Ocean weed called caulerpa. following the destruction of native sea meadows. So keep the sea meadows and cowlurpa wouldn't have spread. What you see is going on here is that alien species are taking advantage of disrupted ecosystems. You can see them in a positive light as the colonizers, as the recreators of ecosystems rather than the primarily villains. At any rate, eliminating the invader rarely works. Cleaning up the pollution might. In a cleaner med, which we now have, cowlurpa is in full retreat. It seems now like a flash in the pan at a time of maximum pollution in the Mediterranean. Generally speaking, if you clean up your local environment, the really aggressive invaders go into retreat. But once a species is established, it rarely makes sense to try and eliminate them. And when we try, the results are often comical. Take the efforts to cleanse aliens from Macquarie Island. It's a bleak, treeless speck halfway between Australia and Antarctica. It has a huge stock of seabirds like this albatross chick, as well as penguins and seals. Great place, I'm sure, never been there. After the island's discovery by Europeans in 1810, hunters regularly visited to slaughter the penguins and seals on the island. Inevitably, animal hitchhikers hopped ashore from the ships during these visits, and the invasion of foreign species had begun. The first were rats. The rats did very well. Their first food supply was the food stores left by the sealers. But the sealers didn't like that, so they brought in cats to hunt the rats. And rabbits came too as an alternative source of food for the sealers' visits to the island. The rabbits especially enjoyed the place. Despite being hunted by other humans and cats, there were some 150 of them by the mid-20th century. Their grazing was turning the place into desert. Now, by then, the sealers no longer came by, and the island was controlled by Australian conservationists who decided to do something about it all. As on the mainland, they brought in myxomatosis, which cut the rabbit population by 90%, and the vegetation started to recover. Well, so far, but soon things were not going to plan. Efforts to get rid of alien species rarely do. Without the rabbits to eat, the cats turned their claws on the island's seabirds. So to protect the birds, the conservationists shot all the cats. But without the cats, the rats then ran riot once more, and they were soon eating even more birds than the cats had. Meanwhile, the rabbits, it turned out, had never completely gone away, and without the cats, their numbers revived, causing renewed soil erosion that culminated in a landslip that buried an important penguin colony. Seems like the eradication was creating more ecological chaos than anything else. So in 2007, the conservationists hatched a grand plan, sort it all out. Everything had to go. They would eradicate the rats, the rabbits, the increasing number of mice. They got going with not so many rats around, and do it by mass poisoning and the introduction of hunting dogs to finish off the last. So sometime in 2012, the dogs finally nailed the last 13 rabbits, burying the rabbit carcasses. Success was declared in 2014, but don't hold your breath, for the poison that seeped into the soils and vegetation to conduct the slaughter has now been killing the seabirds. Weren't they what people were trying to protect in the first place? And nobody yet knows for sure if the eradications have been really achieved. Maybe there are a few animals still skulking around. So if rabbits start popping their heads out of their burrows again, there may be a call to bring the cats back. Really, there's no end to it. It's a cruel and farcical story, really. A lot of blood has been spilt. Compassionate conservation it is not. But my argument is not just that alien species are rather less nasty than we like to pretend, or there are efforts to get rid of them often end badly. Both are certainly true. It is actually that they can be ecological saviours. Successful alien species are proven colonists. They're survivors. They can go places and do things that natives cannot. And that surely in our modern world is something rather valuable. Often aliens help nature recover from damage caused by humans, the pollution that I was discussing earlier. They are the ecological good guys, able to move into damaged environments that the natives cannot cope with. We should often applaud them, surely, for reviving damaged ecosystems and not condemn them for their invasion. For instance, we should surely celebrate what they've achieved on Ascension Island, for instance. The island is a volcanic hulk far out in the South Atlantic, as you can see circled here. The British Empire set up a base as a ship refueling station in the 19th century. Back then, virtually nothing grew there. It was just a volcanic hulk. Charles Darwin condemned its, quote, naked hideousness. Victorian soldiers tried to improve things by planting trees they brought from colonies in Australia, South Africa and Caribbean. On their way home, they brought trees and planted them. They did very well. They climbed up the island's bare central mountain. So what was once naked hideousness is now a mountain called the Green Mountain, and here it is. You can see why. On my visit, I saw coffee bushes and vines, monkey puzzle trees, jacaranda, juniper, bananas, buddleia, palm trees, the Madagascan periwinkle, bamboo, and much, much more as you walk up the mountainside. Insects from across the world flit between the trees. They'd come too. It's a brand new ecosystem made up of essentially random species. Certainly every one is alien. The conservation officer here, Steadson Stroud, is amazed that the world's ecologists don't come to research the place. He says it calls into question a lot of ecological dogmas about how ecosystems co-evolve over millions of years. What can we say about these pristine, perfected ecosystems when we look at a place like Green Mountain? Well, maybe that's why ecologists don't come, is because this is a story they don't want to hear. Instead, the British government's official conservation policy, based on the advice of its ecologists, is to exterminate all the aliens on Ascension Island. All of them. Just leave behind the natives, they say. Well, what natives? The only plant natives are a few ferns, and as you can see here, they now live exclusively on the branches of the alien trees. They seem to get on quite well. Take away the trees and the ferns might now disappear too. So I'm not sure that getting rid of the aliens is a terribly good strategy for the natives. And my guess is that the largest animal on the island, the local land crab, I say local, it clearly came in from somewhere else a few thousand or million years ago. But at any rate, it once ate turtle eggs. Not many turtles left now, so it feasts mostly on the alien fruits of the alien trees, like guava. So take away the alien species and the native land crabs would go hungry too. I don't think that's a very sensible strategy that the British government have set up there. A dogmatic desire to get rid of aliens doesn't make much sense, certainly on a place like that. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't say everything always goes perfectly when unexpected species show up. For every success story like Ascension Island, there are horror stories, like the mice here that hopped from whaling ships onto Gough Island in the South Atlantic. They mutated to double their normal size and took up a carnivorous life, eating their way through one of the world's most important seabird colonies. This mouse looks cuddly, but it probably isn't too cuddly if you're a seabird. But many eradications and attempted eradications are unnecessary. These island horror stories are rare. Even major infestations usually fizzle out after a few years. Most invaders normally settle down and find their niche. American muskrat. It was once, we don't hear much about it now, but it was once the alien plague of Europe. It arrived in Europe courtesy of Joseph II, a prince who lived near Prague. In 1905, he went on a hunting expedition to Alaska and brought 5 muskrats back. He farmed them on his estate for their fur and for sale to other landowners. The inevitable escapes soon created wild populations. There was consternation. The New York Times, as you can see from the clip here, reported that, like the rabbit in Australia and the English sparrow in America, the muskrat has developed a long list of evil traits. It was scoffing river crabs, undermining river banks, for instance. Governments around Europe set up an eradication program to handle the muskrats. Most of those eradication programs failed. The animals continued to spread from the western shores of France to the Russian Far East. They got as far as Japan. But the unexpected ecological disaster that was promised never materialized. Muskrat numbers boomed, peaked, and then declined. They've turned out not to be too troublesome after all. In 2012, a study of alien species by the European Environment Agency that I looked up ignored them altogether. It went on its list of even minor threats. Apart from, well, it did mention them. There was a passing thank you to the muskrats for eating invasive zebra mussels. So a century on, the muskrat is almost at home, I think you would say. I can hear you say, what about the cane toad? Yes, well, this native of South America was deliberately introduced to Queensland in the 1930s to eat a beetle that was consuming sugar plantations. But as we all know, the toad went walkabout and became, well, an ecological time bomb, we're told. Now, it's a tough one to be compassionate about, I agree. It's certainly done an awful lot of damage and poisoned an awful lot of other creatures. The story is that, unlike local toads, the cane toad has glands on the back of its neck that contain a toxin lethal to almost anything that eats it, up to and including creatures the size of Australia's legendary freshwater crocodiles. Now, back home in South America, other species left the toad well alone, they'd learnt. But Australian species didn't know that they were poisonous, so for a while there was carnage. But lately, local species have begun to adapt. Nature does adapt, surprise, surprise. Crocodiles have learned to nibble the toad's back legs and leave the rest. Some snakes have developed tolerance to the toxin. Others still have evolved with small mouths that can't eat the toxic toads. Darwin would be proud of this response to this new threat. Surely this is how nature works in the real world. It's not quite as vulnerable as ecologists sometimes suggest. Anyway, there have been no extinctions, even as a result of the predations of the cane toad. Even in this extreme case, the warnings of an ecological Armageddon didn't come to pass. I don't say it was a good idea to introduce the toads, clearly it wasn't, but let's get real. Nature often copes with aliens rather better than, shall I say, humans. And if you have a profusion of alien species, maybe the best thing to do is to make the best of them, to recognise their place, and how they're becoming really part of local ecosystems all around the world. These days, we increasingly talk about novel ecosystems. There are conferences and books about them. In fact, most of the world is to some extent occupied by novel ecosystems, places where aliens and native species often seem to get along fine. Only humans get upset. I like the story from Puerto Rico, the US-run island in the Caribbean that was recently in the news because of over centuries, farmers had trashed this once forested island. It's certainly not been a virgin ecosystem for a long time. Then a few decades ago, the farmers abandoned the compacted, eroded, sun-baked and increasingly infertile soils. So an interesting question arose: would nature come back? Would the forests recover, or would the land turn to desert as the farmers departed? Surviving native Caribbean trees found it too hard to retake the fields. Didn't look good. But luckily, European colonists over the century had stocked their gardens with alien plants like the African tulip tree shown here. And these aliens proved rather better. They took their chance and they began, in the last 20-30 years, colonizing the fields abandoned by the farmers, reviving the soils to the point where the natives could return. The colonists had done a very useful job. And it turned out that the native species, on their return, their seeds were being spread both by native birds but also by alien birds, nesting often in the alien trees. So there was a rich mix of alien and native species recolonizing the island. But aliens got it going. The idea of aliens bad, natives good, doesn't make much sense in a context like this. And this, I say, is the new wild in the Anthropocene. Urban badlands of post-industrial Europe are buzzing with wildlife. And I think urban landscapes are an area where we see this new kind of novel ecosystem in operation at its best. When industry abandons land, it often leaves behind open spaces and unusual chemical and physical habitats that are colonized by rare and alien species. Old chemical factories, former oil refineries, railway sidings, metal mines, that kind of thing. These badlands in Britain have 1 in 6 of our rare insects, for instance. I took a journey along the industrial wastelands of the Thames estuary. One former power station has 36 different types of bees and is one of only 2 known UK sites for this splendid creature, the distinguished jumping spider. Another old site along the estuary has 656 different invertebrate species, including a dung beetle thought extinct since the 1920s. The derelict oil refinery has more species per hectare than any British nature reserve, 1,300 in all. These are the new wild places, industrial landscapes with flourishing biodiversity, some of it native, some of it alien. Surely we should like these places. Conventional ecological approach would say these are not proper ecosystems, not what was there before, and half of the species are not from those parts either. But that seems to me a false way of looking at nature in the Anthropocene. So to sum up, I think conservationists have got nature wrong. We often like to think of ecosystems as pristine, perfected places where every species has evolved with a specific purpose, and any outside influence, such as feral species gone rogue, could destroy it. It's fragile nature. But the new ecology offers a different vision of nature. Nature that is random, transient, often accidental, constantly evolving, and extremely resilient. Nothing knows its place and nothing needs to. So in the new wild, alien species are nature's desperados and stowaways, if you like, its rebels, and a vital part, surely, of its survival strategy. They can sometimes create problems for us humans. Yes, I agree, and sometimes humans will want to get rid of alien species for our own needs, diseases and crop pests and that kind of things. But let's not confuse that with what's right for nature. For nature in the Anthropocene, alien species bring new skills to recover from the effects of our chainsaws and ploughs and pollution. And if you think about it, migration of species is how nature will often cope with climate change, for instance. How else? If climate zones are moving, species will have to move too. So the idea that we should stop them doing so seems perverse in the extreme. To rewild the planet, we need to reboot conservation, I believe, to help these go-getters, not try and freeze them out. Conservationists must start promoting nature where and how it really is. That means sometimes cheering on the colonists, not hunting them down, for these migrant species are, after all, nature's winners. They are the future.